Okay, so let me kick this off. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new session of Sitecore User Group Jaipur. And in today's session, we want to introduce Kelly Rusk, who will be presenting today with this topic. So, Kelly is currently working as a VP of Technology and having a great experience in Sitecore. He's also a Sitecore Technology MVP. So, I'm going to hand over the session to Kelly, and I think Kelly, you can start the session.
Great. Thank you and good day, everyone. And I'm really honored and appreciate the opportunity to speak with this morning today about DevOps and governance and Sitecore containers. So I'm going to go through a lot of very deep topics. And as we go through these, we're going to hold some questions. And I hope coming away from this session that you not only learn some stuff about Sitecore containers, but DevOps and governance that you can apply across platforms. There's a lot of interesting information here we're going to dive into. A little bit about myself. Been in this industry for a little over 25 years, which just means that each day I learn something new. I'm always humbled by how much information is out there. I tend to focus on architecting, implementing, developing large-scale Sitecore implementations. So I tend to really focus on enterprise aspects, so very much scaled, large XP or composable type architectures and environments. I love sharing the Sitecore community. That's why I'm here today with you. And I'm very active in the community and just try to contribute as I can. Please note my Twitter handle and my personal blog. I'm very active on both, and reach out if you have questions. Please reach out and ask away, because I love collaborating. So today we're going to talk about the assumptions for the presentation, what makes containers special, talk about the governance consideration for containers, and there are a few, DevOps considerations, like what are you going to have to change about your DevOps when you have a containerized environment, and go through an example DevOps flow using the containers as an example. And one thing that's important is that as we talk through the assumptions today, we're going to be focusing on a few things, and that is that we're using Docker for local development. And I want to notate that even if you don't deploy your images to an Azure Kubernetes cluster, you can still use Docker for your local development, and then just port your normal code out of GitHub to a PaaS environment or virtual machines. There's some key advantages of Docker we'll talk about here momentarily as well. We're also assuming that we do have an Azure Kubernetes cluster for a dev, QA, UAT, and production environment. So we're going to talk about stage gates and flow across that from a DevOps perspective. We're going to heavily leverage the Azure Container Registry for both image storage and distribution of the images. Looking at Sitecore CLI or other tools for serialization. So beyond our code, which is inside of the images, how do we serialize that content over? And we're not replacing our clusters on deploy. We're going to put images into pods. So our deployment modeling is around that. And we're also going to leverage Azure SQL for database storage. This is a very much a normal enterprise case for an Azure Kubernetes cluster. So with that, let's talk about what makes containers special. If you're not using containers today, it's okay. Let's at least give some knowledge about what are these images, these containers, and what they do. So the main benefits of containers are really about coming down to some key aspects about speed, because it's very easy to start without dependencies. And we'll talk about how with containers, you remove the operating system layer. So if you're working on a team of developers and you all have different workstations, you don't have to worry about competing with each other about what you have to install or not installed, or maybe a program running on a production server. That goes away because now you just have a container and speed with no dependencies to worry about. Efficiency is a lot more lightweight, which is going to help you in testing and localizing. So when I think about the Sitecore images that Sitecore provides for local Docker, it's per Sitecore role, and it's very lightweight, so I can emulate what production looks like. So I'm not going to be running anymore a single XP0 Sitecore installation. What I'm going to be running is all the separate roles as if production. So if production is XP with the CMS, CD, ton of XNX servers, I can have that locally now and test with architectural integrity. within these images, which is very, very powerful. Isolation is another big part of images and containers. It's very secure and it's in its own space. It's immutable, so that means that I can't change it. So when I have that image created, which we'll talk about the layers momentarily, I can't go in and change things, which is a huge benefit for protecting your environment and preventing things like deploying to production in a way that you're going to add code to the images. The image stays the same all the way through your environments. And that's very powerful and portable. So I could get off an airplane, say, here is the image, and we could literally grab that image and drop it in across any environment. So again, that portability allows us to execute as long as the runtime environment is supported. A couple of key other advantages here is that it's scalable. So when I am working, let's say I want to add more containers. Maybe I have a CD container and I have a CMS container. Maybe I have some custom applications. I could have custom applications living containers and literally just add those to the environment. And now I've got some loose coupling, but still environmental integrity. And for a developer, that comes down to I'll have faster builds, be more modular, and better collaboration. So when we look at the architecture of this, in the past you have virtual machines with that guest operating system and a hypervisor that it ran on top of. That goes away. Now your apps are actually living and run on top of container runtime, and you don't have this guest operating system. Bear in mind that if you are using Docker locally, it is going to take up some resources. So you got to do some work there, but this is going to take down that stack a lot more. And because you don't have that guest operating system to worry about and all the interdependencies, you now can just get to work on your apps with some guidelines because of the images in a lot more efficient manner. Now, because this constrains and changes how you're operating, you also need to take in consideration some key themes around how you do governance. So if you're not doing governance today, I highly recommend creating a governance plan, including the governance committee and communication plan that's going to support this. You want to create 10 policies and standards. So an example policy we'll talk about in a minute is how do I post an image up through the stage gates? So that's something that's critical for us to understand. You want to meet regularly and improve upon your policies and standards, because if you don't document this and don't communicate out your governance policies and standards, you're going to struggle. It's very critical to go through this and say, yes, I'm going to document our branching strategy. I'm going to document how we deploy. That can save you so much time and risk. And as we look to this, I'm not going to leave you abandoned. I have a link here, which I'll share in the presentation afterwards. I have a whole Sitecore governance template you can use that has a bunch of sample placeholders to create governance policies for. But when you think about containers, there's some specific aspects to consider. So you want to document your branching deployment strategy, because it's a big deal in containers because you've changed the whole way you're looking at things. Your image storage and security is very critical. Where are you going to store these little containers? And these little images are going to live in containers. Stage gates and approvals, we'll talk about that momentarily. Disaster recovery becomes different in an image environment because you don't have individual code you're changing. You have one image that houses all of your code. You need to change your DR a little bit. Monitoring and troubleshooting. How do I do this with APM in both platform? Like, how do I manage my cluster? Pod-specific environmental variables. So if I have one image that's going to be the same across the environments, I'm not doing separate builds for each environment anymore. I have one image that comes up through dev. If it passes dev and it's approved, it can go to QA. So how do I make sure that from dev to QA that have different connection streams, how do I make sure that they actually get that? Well, the answer is on the pod that the image lives in, you're going to assign environmental variables to say, okay, that same image, now it's over in QA, it needs to connect to all the QA resources and not dev. So that's just an example of a policy and standard you could write. You need to also consider your environmental security. So beyond your images, what are you doing in AKS? Are you using private link? Anything in the networking? that surrounds a Sitecore environment. What kind of Azure tooling you can use? Are you using Key Vault for your secrets? Even environmental variables? Are you using Azure DevOps? And I do recommend Azure DevOps. It's a big, big thing to consider. What about Solar, Redis, and external integrations? These are big things that play in your environment. And then lastly, don't forget about your SQL environment. What are the rules that you apply for how you manage this environment? So when we think about an example policy, one might be that all releases must flow through the proper stage gates. And that's kind of like a law. This is our law of our Sitecore environment. And the standard, which details how this happens, might be like releases go to the development environment first by tagging an image to deploy them to the Azure ACR. And if devs approved, tag the images go to QA, and then UAT, and then to staging. And finally, on production, you might have an approval workflow in your Azure DevOps pipeline. It requires sign-off from the release team in order to promote that to production. So what we've done here is we've detailed out exactly how we're supposed to operate. And doing this is going to save you so much time. I know writing governance cannot be very exciting sometimes, but it's necessary. It's a necessary evil, because if you don't have this, you're running around asking people, what do we do? And you're wasting time that should be spent on development. So that's why we have the governance is such a big piece on this. And you can see that there are different aspects for containers you need to consider, because it's just different technology. So when we think about this holistic containerized aspects from a DevOps perspective, there's a few considerations. So how do I go from where I'm working today into a normal environment? There are some things that very much stay the same, whether you're PaaS or virtual machines. But working with images, it's going to be a little different. So I want to talk about those considerations. So there's some changes to the development experience. And that's going to mean that instead of everyone installing Sitecore locally, you're now encapsulated within Docker. And you're going to use the Sitecore base image to combine your custom code on top of this. And you're going to make an image per Sitecore role. So instead of having a content management server and doing a bunch of transforms to make that a content delivery server, you have a separate image for CMS, a separate for CD, and a separate for identity server, and an XM topology. And an XP, even more, each and every role gets its own image, which is very powerful, very liberating from a governance perspective. You know, and once you create your custom images per Sitecore role, you can test these locally. So when we talk about the Docker CLI, I can literally run the full architecture. And again, we're going away from that XP0, right? XP0 is a bit of a trap in that it doesn't have the same architectural integrity, meaning the same roles and setup as you would for what you're deploying into. So instead of hoping that everything works when you decouple out XP0, now you can be absolute with these custom images you've created. Maybe you've said, okay, here's my new CD role. Once your images are ready, you're not going to deploy individual code files. You're going to create an image that includes both the Sitecore image itself and your custom code, maybe any modules or tools, and you're going to push that into something called the Azure Container Registry. And the Azure Container Registry is here to support you, and we'll talk about that momentarily because it houses your images. So as developers, you can actually push everything together and have this centralized for distribution across your clusters. Content serialization is just as critical. So you've created an image, but now you've got to get these data templates and maybe some content over. So content serialization using the Sitecore CLI is really, really helpful. And one other aspect here is because you're merging multiple dev branches prior to creating custom images, you need to make some decisions about how does that image get created. And I have a few tips on how they can be created here momentarily. So Azure Container Registry, this is your friend. So even if you're not going to use an Azure Kubernetes cluster to house or host your Sitecore environment, maybe you made the choice as a dev team just to use Docker for local development. This is still a great place to store your images or things you might want to share as a team, and maybe do some build tasks. So we'll talk about ACR tasks momentarily. And again, this is just within Azure. You can set these up quite easily and have a destination point for deploying your images. And when you do that, you're literally going to tag your image. So when you do a command line to push into your Azure Container Registry, you might tag. You might say, okay, Docker tag. Here's a destination. Here's where I'm calling this file my hello world version 1. So I tag it first to give it identification, and then I push it into the ACR. And now if I go into the ACR, I'm going to see my images with the right directory information. And so this might actually be tagged as dev CD server or CD server dev. So now you know that this CD image you just created belongs in the dev environment in the CD server node. You want to look at ACR tasks for image builds. So ACR tasks, the Azure Container Registry, can do tasks to actually build your image. So if you have multiple people on a team, you don't have to wait for one person who approves the final pull request to create the image. You can actually schedule your image builds in a very CI/CD mindset. You can use webhooks to trigger events. So maybe after you put your image up, you want to kick off serialization. You could do that with potentially with a webhook, or maybe some other API aspects you have. Webhooks are very much API dependent. I'd also highly recommend using Azure DevOps pipelines to deploy to AKS. So when you think about your cluster that's over here, you have your container registry. How do you get things out of the registry to the cluster? Well, that's where you can do a pipeline to say, okay, using kube control, I'm going to deploy the images I have in storage based on their tags to the proper environments. So from a DevOps perspective, now you have something very clean that you can trust and even automate. And using Azure DevOps alongside Sitecore serialization is awesome. So you can literally create all these pipelines, approval workflows, and gone are the days of having to depend on one person in the middle of the night or long maintenance windows. So a few other key aspects when you think about this, let's talk about the architecture, right? So in a production environment, you'll have an Azure Kubernetes service. Inside of that service, you're going to have a Kubernetes cluster. And that cluster is going to consist of a bunch of nodes. So you might have a node that, and that node is backed by a node pool made up of virtual machines. You might have a node pool with a bunch of nodes for maybe your CD servers, or your CMS might be in a node. And you might have a separate node for XConnect, or your XConnect roles could all be separate nodes. And nodes literally run your application workloads. And the control plane provides all this orchestration so that your CD, your CMS, your XConnect, if you're using XConnect, or even composable, let's say you have some composable aspects from Sitecore, like some of these SaaS aspects, you need to be able to communicate with those SaaS aspects, right, over third-party integrations. And so this cluster that you have, think about in the past, you maybe had servers with virtual machines. Now you have a cluster with nodes. So kind of map it that way. And then what's been called pods, which are more like IIS. So when you think about your cluster, you might have multiple node pools, like I said before, that have like, maybe I've got a node pool for my CD server, maybe a node pool for my Solar server and Zookeeper, maybe I have a node pool for the editing experience, and a node pool for XConnect, right? And your application, though, is going to live inside of a pod. So you got your node and then your pod. And think about pods almost like IIS, or even better, like an app service when you think about PaaS or Azure PaaS, because you can assign environmental variables. And usually you have like a one-to-one. Like if you have a node, you're just going to have one pod that has your image. So I'll have like, here's my node that houses my CD image. And that CD image, when I make that image go to the next environment, I have environmental variables on the pod that say, okay, you're in dev right now, so you're going to connect to all the dev resources. But image, when you are tagged for QA, that pod has different variables for the connection strings and other variables for that environment. So in this aspect, you have to think about that encapsulation. The service is here to hold everything in something, a resource group, right? You're going to have nodes that represent your different Sitecore roles. Those nodes will have pods that really power your environmental variables and some of those unique environmental controls. And you're going to use kube control to really bring stuff over and interoperate with the environment. So these are big changes architecturally. But when you think about it, it's the same kind of structure you've had in the past. With VMs and the host servers, it's just brought down to a different layer and more of a runtime. And that runtime gives you some advantages. So when you think about these DevOps, this does kind of force a shift to, as you focus on images, kind of slow down to go faster, because you're going to have to create these images. You can't just grab code in the middle of the night and say, oh, I'm going to do patch production. You can't be changing the code on production anymore. That image is immutable. So there's an advantage here where it's going to force better code quality, and it's going to force better collaboration. Your AKS cluster has very much distinct images and layers where there's images beyond the images. You're going to have content, and you're going to have applications, and maybe third-party aspects like SaaS, right? If you do like an XM environment, you might want to connect to Sitecore Personalize or Sitecore Send or Order Cloud, whatever that is, or aka Sitecore Commerce. You need to take into account beyond your base images. How does this all connect in? I already mentioned the images are immutable, so no changing files at the last possible second is a fix. I know this is a pain point for some individuals, but every time you change something in production, it means that something went wrong in your lower stages, that you didn't develop properly, you didn't QA properly, you didn't go through the proper stage gates to make sure that things are working properly. And because we have one image that is going to be the same across the board, environmental variables play a huge role. And let's talk about this. If I deploy an image, it goes to dev, and we say it's okay. It goes to QA and it passes QA, and we say, great. Keep going. Now I go to UAT and they say, oh, something's wrong. I need to go back to dev, my local machine, fix that, and have it go through these stage gates again to make sure it hits every single point. Because when you change something, you want to think about regression testing. You could change something that could affect another component, and you could end up always having some challenges. So these kind of DevOps that we have in place for containers really forces good practices on top of you. And it can be frustrating, right? You want to fix something fast and you're told to fix fast. You have to slow down to get it right. This is going to reduce so much pain for you. We know that remediating or fixing something can take 3.5 times longer than doing it right the first time. And we want to have more fun. So we want to get all the platform issues and all the code issues and bugs out of the way of the production environment and have you really executing at a high level. And that's why stage gates are so critical due to these immutable aspects. So let's walk through a sample DevOps flow, and we can show an example of how this all comes together. And you can see how the governance is always kind of there, implicitly undocumented, and how this changes how you might work. And we're going to do that with a little example DevOps flow of us going all the way through to deploying to production. So the first thing you would do is you would set up your Docker development environment locally. And I have a link right here on how to do that. Now with that, you're going to get the Sitecore base images. And that's going to vary by the version of Sitecore. So you can see over here, I've got these Sitecore images, like here's a CM, CD, XConnect, etc. Maybe I'll have some Solar, SQL, VMs. Maybe there's some modules. So that's what Sitecore provides you. It provides you the base Sitecore environment. And it is per role. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get that base runtime, which is right here, the CM. You're going to add maybe some tools or modules and your custom code. And when you have that, you're going to build the image. And remember, we can also use the ACR task to build images for us. But let's assume right now you're just doing local Docker. You're going to build and create a custom image. So you start with a little image. You create these layers to stack it up and create a new custom image. And that becomes your custom Sitecore images that you push into your registry. And that registry, again, is where it goes off into your cluster. Or you might just create these custom images and view them locally to see that everything's working properly before just deploying the code out of GitHub if you don't have a cluster to go to. But you still get the power of testing everything properly and having like a mini environment. It's almost like having your own little production. So creating those custom images are just critical. Putting those in place, you can do a Docker compose, build, and push, and literally have your whole environment there and be able to view everything working together. So again, gone are those days of XP0 where you're like, okay, that's XP0. I have a full Sitecore environment. You actually don't. XP0 is a local dev environment and it merges roles together. So you can't test separate Xconnect roles. You can't test the differences between a CM or CD server. But now with images, you can because every role is distinct of each other. So that's as critical for setting up your local dev environment to get that in place and work on those custom images and test locally. And when you test locally, I put a link here to how to run your first Sitecore instance. It just gives you a lot of power to see everything come together. It's like you, again, like you have your own prod instance. And now that you've tested locally, you're going to prepare to push this to the Azure Container Registry. And that means you should tag these images and say, okay, I have an image. It's a dev CD image. It's tagged. And now if I put that into the registry, some good things can happen because now I can deploy that appropriately. And you can and should really look at automating all of this, including serialization. Instead of manually doing this every single time, think about the modules you have in serialization. How do I set up my Sitecore CLI to match the images I'm going to port? So once you have this and you're building images, it's very powerful. And the big question is, well, what do I do as far as a multiple team dynamic? How do I get everything into the container registry with multiple developers? Well, all of you can go into the same GitHub. And you could have an individual tag it and push it. They can have an individual responsible for pull requests do that typically. But even better is that if all of you come into GitHub and manage your pull request and merge everything together, what you can do is literally use an ACR task to automatically build images from GitHub. And I put a link here on how to do that. So instead of having a super user, and if they're out for the day, what do you're like, hey, submits out, what are you going to do? Okay, turns out, what are we going to do? You don't have to worry about that if you use some automation. So you could say, okay, everyone's checked in their code. As soon as this pull request is approved, we're automatically going to build images and port them into the container registry. So you could have very much a continuous integration and continuous deployment scenario. And while right now it's more common to kind of build locally, tag it, and then push an image up to the Azure Container Registry by a central person, please test with Azure DevOps. It automates so much. So again, in this situation, what's happened here is as a local developer, I can create images to test my code. But if I'm a team, all that code lives in my GitHub. So that's where your pull requests are going to happen. You're going to work together in that dynamic and then create an image that encapsulate not only your custom code, but any tools, modules, and the base Sitecore environment. And now you have a full, literally like a little CD server or CMS server ready to go. And that's a very, very powerful thing. So when you have this in place, how do I get this over to my cluster now? So you can use kube control to grab it from the ACR and push it into your cluster. So if you have it tagged right now and say, hey, this is my CD for dev, I want this in the environment, you can read that and say, oh, you're the dev CD, I'm going to put you in CD pod for dev based on your tags. And here's where it's fun. Because you have that single tag, what you can do is you can kind of retag the images. So it's very much a build once, deploy many. And with environmental variables that are different per environment, that core image you made will never change. So you're not going to have all the risk and challenges of different aspects flowing in. your CD server stays the same. You're just going to change the connections as you go to each environment. So it's very normal. You just might, in your Azure DevOps pipeline, or even manually with queue control, say, okay, I tagged you as dev CD server, but now you passed dev, approved to move on. Now I'm going to tag you as QA CD server. And that's going to send you to the QA environment, into the CD pod, with the environmental variables there for the connection strings for the QA environment. And so that's how you kind of move around these stage gates. And now you're deploying all the way through. And I really, really strongly recommend that you leverage an Azure DevOps pipeline with an approval step. So when you go to production, risks get a little higher, stakes get a little higher. And this is where you can literally use this pipeline to move things over with an approval that says, yes, we are ready to go to production. So many options here with the same methodology is that image has to be immutable. You do not create separate images per environment. Don't do that. You're going to end up in a lot of pain if you do that. And you may be tempted to do that. If you do that, you're going to fail. You're going to come up that's different. If you build that image once and make sure you use that same image across your environments, you're going to make sure it gets tested thoroughly and reduce the risk. So do not, under any situation, create separate images for each environment, because they will be different and you end up hurting yourself. Is where you have to use environmental variables to keep things in place. We also need to serialize our content. So we talked about the image, but you want to use that Sitecore serialization. And you basically would maybe tag your image, put it into dev, but then you need to serialize the data template, so the content that comes with that. And to this end, I highly recommend using that Azure DevOps pipeline to build your images and serialize content in a very ordinal fashion. That's going to bring it to the right environment. And building it, you might have an ACR task from the DevOps pipeline to build that image and tag that image and push it to the next environment with your serialization. And serialization is really important. And generally, it's a step after image building, tagging, and pushing in. So generally, your image goes first, and you serialize second. And so if you have one pipeline to do both, you can reduce time and reduce risk and really test this for all these different stages as you move towards production. And this really creates a centralized environment and approach for building, tagging, and pushing without needing a super developer to create images or having people override each other's work by serializing things that should not be serialized. So it's very important you think about this and you write your governance policies to support this and support each other. And once you have deployed these aspects and you serialize your content, there's some good post-deployment steps you should follow. And you got to make sure every time you move across these stage gates from dev, QA, UAT, staging, QA, pre-prod, whatever you have, all the way to production, you've got to make sure it does the proper testing. And you want to test off of one code base. So again, don't create separate images per environment. It's the same image. You're just changing the environmental variables as it goes to each environment. Make sure you properly test this. You're going to want to publish and rebuild indexes as appropriate. And if you're using commerce, I'm talking about Sitecore commerce, not the new order cloud, you must bootstrap and restart commerce engines. You may need to clear your Redis caches, and you need to warm up the Sitecore commerce caches. Those are all critical steps when you think about commerce as you deploy in a containerized environment. And lastly, activate your disaster recovery plan. And what does that look like? Well, you should write a governance policy. So you have images. You could retag, say, listen, this is my CD server. It's version 1. I deployed version 2. Version 2 has a problem we just found in production. Despite all our testing, something came up. Always does, right? Well, you can retag it and say, okay, image 1, I need you to replace production. And then maybe restore from backup the databases that I had before serialization. So think about what is your fallback strategy. And in a lot of instances, it might be good to have a blue and a green production environment. So you could deploy to green, test everything when it's ready, route traffic to it. So you'd have a traffic manager, a cluster for blue, a cluster for green, and use traffic manager to determine which of the environments would receive the traffic. So in all these aspects, from local development to the container registry to your cluster deployment and these stage gates and approvals, you can move with a lot more integrity, a lot more trust of your solution with images, and into a better place. Now it does restrict what you can do, but I think that's a good restriction. I know we're tempted to fix stuff in environments and have different code bases per environment. Doing so is a very slippery slope and get you into a lot of trouble. So this is why having those images immutable really helps you to have tighter governance and better success. It takes time to get set up and working well, but once it's working well, you have a good environment. And we know that Sitecore is not pushing containers right now. They are very much about XM Cloud and the SaaS solution. The reality is this is still an option. And even outside of the option, I'm hoping that today's presentations help teach you more about images, so you can even use local Docker for development advantages. You could use Docker for local development and push to Sitecore SaaS. Do you know the XM Cloud? You could do that in this environment and have better integrity in your solution, better collaboration, and a better encapsulation for security aspects. So with that, I wanted to step back for a moment and definitely take some questions here.
If you have any question, you can raise your hand or use chat window.
And I see Shilpi's joined us. Shilpi, hello, good evening, and great to hear you. Great to see you again.
Hi, Kelly. Yeah, same here, Kelly. Good to catch up after long.
Yes.
Very interesting presentation today. I did work for a company which had implemented containers. I mean, after Rackspace. And what you mentioned is very relevant, though it's very difficult to find this kind of details anywhere. So thank
Yes.
you so much.
No worries. Happy. And in full disclosure, Shilpi and I used to work together, and it was such a pleasure working with her. So we were very much engaged in these kind of dynamics of enterprise scale. It's a change when you go from local development environments, and that's the biggest thing I'm pushing today on you is like, hey, get out of XPO. Stop thinking about XPO. Think about what it'd be like to have your own production environment locally, and how you could work in that. And I will actually email the presentation right after this of Asuma to share with all of you so you can have it available. And it has all the links in there so you can get started.
Yeah, hi, Kelly Srinkuya.
Hi, how are you?
Good. It's really nice presentation. One thing I want to ask is like we also know you try to use containers and we gone through the training as well, but many people have different experience with their local system. So maybe like each one
Yes.
maybe having a different experience, like they used to get many issues. And
Yes.
sometimes what happens is when we try to same thing 2 to 3 times, then it works. So is it same thing
Mhm.
happens with you? And just want to know like, exactly what kind of issue you got when you actually use that and how you
Sure.
resolve that.
So a lot of the issues, how long ago were the issues that you experienced?
I guess 2 to 3 months back.
Okay. And was it the issue with the different Windows versions? Or like, they can local Docker for the Docker desktop for Windows is running one Windows version, or what was the particulars of the issue?
No, actually the window version is same, but the system is different.
So yeah, that's a system issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that the Docker community is aware of, and they're
Okay.
working towards resolving it. I have had some of those issues. It's gone away recently for me. Again, the main thing you want to make sure is that everyone's pulling the Sitecore images, the base images, and putting their custom code on top of it. Generally, what we find is that sometimes the issues are in that they're not respecting the layers. Like they're creating their own, instead of pulling the Sitecore images each time, they're creating their own custom Sitecore images and then deploying on top of them again. So every time you build, you want to make sure fresh Sitecore image for the base Sitecore environment, then your custom code on top of it. But as far as that server differences, make sure that you're running local Docker, your Windows, Docker desktop for Windows. Make sure you're running in Windows mode. It may require the enabling Hyper-V, so that's resolved some issues for some individuals, because we know that there's two different ways to run Windows containers and Docker desktop.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And what she's speaking about is that you have this challenge of the containers that are provided from the images provided from Sitecore. Their server version is different than the runtime that Docker Desktop is running for Windows. So there's been some challenges there. We have to potentially rebuild a few times to get it working.
Okay.
Great question.
I also want to ask one question. Like recently, I got chance to work on a project that was set up with Docker. So,
Sure.
I actually there was instruction that was manual to stop all these solar stances those were running on my system. So I'm working on multiple Sitecore projects, and I have like 10 solar stances. I was testing something, so that's why it get created. So is there any command like when we use Docker compose up D? So is there any command that it can automatically stop all the solar stances running on my system and then start installing things?
So I would recommend an architectural change. I would actually have a solar container. So instead of worrying about your local environment, I would
Mhm.
encapsulate solar as another container. And when you look
Okay.
at the default Sitecore images, you'll have a solar container. So I would use the solar container so that way you're not worried about your local environment and all those changes, because it makes it hard, right? Because now you
Yeah.
got to shut down all these ports, encapsulate it inside of the Docker environment. So this is again the encapsulation we talked about, and having everything in that box. Now you don't worry about it going outside. It's almost like you're running Hyper-V locally, and all the VMs belong to one network, and they don't talk to another one. So I would actually try to spin up a solar container. And I would use Solar Cloud. Now, this is where it gets fun. Solar Cloud, it doesn't, Solar Cloud's a technology. It doesn't mean that you have multiple nodes. You can have a scaled Solar Cloud with like 3 nodes that are all
Yeah.
running Solar Cloud and Zookeeper. But I would run a Solar Cloud container that's connected to the environment I'm developing in and remove all those dependencies on shutting things down on your local environment.
Got it. Got it. Thanks.
Oh, but great question. And again, a lot of this stuff comes down to, how much is Sitecore going to keep using the Sitecore AKS? Irrespective of that, there's a lot of power using Docker for local development.
Yeah.
And I think Sitecore needs to update maybe the OS to match the Windows, the Docker for desktop version to resolve that previous server's issue.
Yeah. Anyone has any questions, so you can ask.
And I'm happy to answer any kind of non-Docker questions you may have as well. So anything non-containers, or you stubbed your toe on a Sitecore implementation, I'm happy to answer anything I can to help out. I'm here just happy to share with all of you, and thankful that you would give me your time today.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments, questions, or concerns? Did this presentation help you to understand how images compile and work together, or at least give you a few things to think about?
Yes,
Yeah, I think,
definitely.
yeah, definitely that was helpful for us.
Good. Yeah, I don't have all the
One,
answers. Yes, go ahead. Ask away.
yeah. Yeah, I was just asking actually, when we use like containers, in that case, we need to stop the other services like IIS and like SQL and other services. So is it required all the time or only for
No.
the installation?
Um, no, you don't need to be stopping. There's no IIS in a Kubernetes cluster. So IIS is gone. There's the container runtime takes care of this. So it's not like you have an IIS. If you are working, are you talking about the Kubernetes cluster or your local environment?
Local environment.
So local environment, if you encapsulate things, you might need to stop a competing site in IIS. So if you're running IIS locally, because it does connect in order to hit the actual like CD server, you're going to have IIS running. So you may need to do that. And that's part of switching to the environment you're working on. And what I'd recommend is to do a little PowerShell script locally that you can literally set, okay, here's my set of IIS entries for my one environment, turn it off because I'm working on the other. So generally, you're not going to be switching between environments too much locally, hopefully. You know, you want to be very much focused on this one and maybe run PowerShell to switch over to the other one. And you could do some fun stuff with like shutting down images. You could, you know, use the Docker, you know, compose up or down to take things down as well. So I'd probably play with a little bit of PowerShell to automate some of that to make it easier for you.
Okay, so in nutshell, we can say that for local environment, at least we always need to stop all this thing, and
Yes.
maybe like we can have a PowerShell script. We can do all this stuff for turning on and off.
Yes, that's what I would recommend looking at.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
No worries. Good questions. It makes us all want to get together and build something today, right? Any other questions or things I can help answer for you?
I think we don't have any other question.
All right. Then I will just say a big thank you for taking
Yeah.
time out of your day to speak with me. It's my pleasure to share, and I hope and pray that all is well for you and your loved ones. Stay healthy, and if you have questions, please reach out. And again, Shopi, it's always great to see you and hear your voice.
Thank you
Same
so
here.
much.
Yeah, I think we all appreciate all the input we have received today, Kelly.
No
Please
worries.
take
All right, I will, and I'll email the presentation. It has a lot of links in it, so that way you can have the presentations locally. You can go through them again. Again, the main point is, even if you don't go to Kubernetes, think about your governance, think about your DevOps, and consider Docker for local development. So with that, everyone have a good evening. Take care, okay?
Thank
Sure,
you so much,
thanks.
Kelly, for your
Thanks.
time.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Oh,
Bye.
Thank
thank
you.
you
Yep.
all.
Bye
Take
bye.
care.
Bye. Take
Bye
care
all.
too. Bye.